Welcome to Flow Speak Studio, where English flows naturally. Let's start speaking with confidence.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Emma, and I'm really glad you're here today. I want to say that slowly because this episode is about slowness, about choosing your words carefully, not because you're afraid, but because you care. And I'm here with Alex, as always.
Hey everyone, I'm Alex. And before we even say what today's topic is, I want to say this. If you've ever stayed quiet just because you didn't want to sound rude, you're not alone. And honestly, that feeling is much heavier than people realize.
Yes, today we're talking about something that almost every English learner struggles with, but rarely talks about openly. How do you express your opinion? How do you disagree? How do you say what you really think without sounding rude, without sounding aggressive, without sounding cold or uncomfortable?
And the tricky part is that this isn't just about English vocabulary. It's emotional, it's cultural, it's personal. Because many of us were taught, directly or indirectly, that having an opinion can be dangerous, that disagreeing can damage relationships, that speaking up might make people judge us.
Exactly. And when you add English to that mix, a second language, everything feels more fragile. You start thinking things like, what if I sound too direct? What if they think I'm angry? What if my tone sounds wrong? And suddenly, you don't say anything at all.
I remember this so clearly. When I was younger and using English in professional settings, I'd sit in meetings with a lot to say, ideas, feedback, opinions. And inside my head, everything was clear. But when it was time to speak, my brain would freeze, not because I didn't know the words, but because I didn't know how they would land.
That fear of impact, that's powerful. I felt it too, especially in situations where I cared about being liked, being respected, or not creating tension. Sometimes I would rehearse a sentence 10 times in my head, soften it again and again, and then by the time I was ready, the moment had already passed.
And afterward, you replay it. You think, I should have said something. Or worse, why am I like this in English? That inner dialogue can be brutal.
So if you're listening right now and thinking, yes, this is me, we want you to know this episode is for you. Not to teach you how to sound fake polite, not to give you robotic phrases, but to help you sound like yourself, clearly and respectfully.
Because expressing opinions doesn't mean being rude, and being polite doesn't mean disappearing. There's a middle space, and that's where confident English lives.
In this episode, we're going to talk about real moments. Moments at work where you disagree with a colleague, moments with friends where you don't feel the same way, moments where you want to say, I don't agree, but your mouth says nothing.
We're also going to talk about the inner pressure, that voice that says, don't say it, be careful, just nod, and how that voice slowly makes you feel smaller in conversations.
But we'll also talk about growth, about learning how to soften your language without losing your meaning, about choosing words that feel natural, not scripted, about understanding that tone is not just about grammar, it's about intention.
And most importantly, we want this episode to feel like a conversation you've already had in your life. The kind you replay in your head while walking home. The kind that stays with you.
So take a breath. Let your shoulders drop. You don't need to be perfect here. You're just listening, and that's enough. All right, let's gently move into the heart of this topic. You know, Alex, I want to start this block with a very honest feeling, one that I think a lot of listeners recognize immediately, even if they've never put it into words. That moment when you have an opinion, and it's not even a strong or aggressive one, but you still feel your body hesitate. Your chest tightens a little. Your thoughts slow down. And something inside you says, maybe it's better not to say anything. I've felt that in so many situations. Meetings, friendships, even casual conversations. And every time, it feels strangely heavy, like I'm carrying words I never put down.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that the opinion itself is usually not the problem. It's not like we're thinking, I want to attack someone or I want to start a fight.
Most of the time, the opinion is reasonable, calm, thoughtful. But the fear isn't about what we think, it's about how it will be received. I remember being in a team meeting once where everyone was agreeing on an idea that, honestly, I thought had some clear issues. Nothing dramatic, just practical concerns. Budget, timing, pressure on the team. And while everyone else nodded, I felt this internal tension growing. My mind was active, but my mouth stayed quiet.
That internal tension, that's such a good way to describe it. It's like your thoughts are alive but trapped, and the longer you stay quiet, the louder they become inside you. I've had moments where I nodded along, smiled, even agreed out loud, and then later, alone, I felt frustrated with myself, not angry at others, angry at me. I'd think, why didn't I just say it kindly? Why did I disappear?
Exactly. And that frustration doesn't just vanish, it accumulates. Over time, you start associating English with silence, with holding back, with playing it safe. And that's dangerous, not because it makes you rude or quiet, but because it slowly disconnects you from your voice.
Yes, and what makes it even more complicated is that politeness means different things in different cultures. In some cultures, being polite means being very indirect, soft, almost invisible. In others, clarity is politeness. So when you're speaking English, you're not just translating words, you're navigating cultural expectations, power dynamics, and your own personality all at once. No wonder it feels overwhelming.
I want to share a small story here, nothing dramatic, but very real. I once worked with someone who was extremely direct, very efficient, very clear, and every time they shared an opinion, I noticed how calm they sounded. At first, I thought, wow, they're confident. But later, I realized something deeper. They weren't confident because they were loud. They were confident because they trusted that clarity wasn't rude. That realization stayed with me.
That's such an important distinction, because many learners think, if I soften my language, I lose power, or if I'm clear, I'll sound rude. But actually, clarity and kindness can exist together. The problem is when we don't know how to combine them, silence feels safer.
And silence feels polite, but it has a cost. I've seen people become invisible in conversations, not because they lack ideas, but because they don't feel emotionally safe expressing them. And what's painful is that later, those same people often feel misunderstood, like others don't really know who they are or what they think.
Yes, because when you don't express your opinions, people fill in the gaps for you. They assume you agree. They assume you're fine. They assume you don't care. And inside, you're thinking, that's not true at all.
This is why this episode matters so much, because expressing opinions isn't about winning arguments or dominating conversations. It's about presence. It's about being seen and heard as you are. And English should never be the reason you feel smaller.
I completely agree. And I want to say something directly to the listener right now. If you've ever thought, I'm not confident in English, I want you to gently reframe that. Maybe you're not unconfident. Maybe you're careful. Maybe you're empathetic. Maybe you've learned to read rooms deeply. And now you just need the language that matches that sensitivity.
That's such a beautiful way to put it. And that's exactly what we'll continue exploring, how to give language to that care instead of suppressing it.
So in the next block, we're going to move deeper into the inner dialogue, the thoughts that happen before you speak, the doubts, the overthinking, the fear of being misunderstood. Because once we understand that inner voice, we can start responding to it differently.
And when that inner voice softens, speaking becomes lighter.
I want to slow this down and go inside the moment before someone speaks, because that's where the real battle happens, not out loud, not in the conversation, inside.
Yeah, that quiet space right before words come out or don't. It's where thoughts start racing, but none of them feel safe enough to choose.
Exactly. And the thought usually doesn't sound dramatic. It sounds subtle, almost reasonable. It says things like, what if they misunderstand me? What if this sounds too direct? What if I hurt someone without meaning to? And because those thoughts sound polite and responsible, we trust them.
But what we don't notice is how fast those thoughts multiply. 1 becomes 2, 2 become 10, and suddenly you're not thinking about your opinion anymore, you're managing imagined reactions.
Yes, imagined reactions. You're already seeing their face, already hearing their tone, already feeling the awkward silence that hasn't even happened. And your body reacts as if it's real. Your shoulders tense, your breathing changes, your voice disappears.
I've felt that so clearly. I remember once being in a group discussion where someone said something I genuinely disagreed with, not emotionally, just logically. And in my head, I thought, I could explain this calmly, but then another thought came in. What if they think I'm criticizing them? And then another, what if everyone thinks I'm difficult? And then another, what if my English sounds harsh even if my intention isn't?
And at that point, you're no longer having a conversation. You're having a negotiation with fear.
Exactly. And fear is very persuasive. It tells you silence is safer. It tells you waiting is smarter. It tells you next time. But next time often never comes.
What hurts the most is that after the moment passes, the clarity returns. You suddenly know exactly what you could have said. Your English sounds perfect in your head. Your tone feels balanced. Your intention feels clear. And you think, why didn't I say it like this?
That's one of the most painful experiences for language learners. Not failing, but postponing yourself.
And over time, this creates an identity. You start thinking, I'm the quiet one. I'm the agreeable one. I'm the one who doesn't cause tension. But that identity wasn't chosen. It was built through repeated self-silencing.
And here's the part that really needs to be said clearly. Wanting to sound polite does not mean you're weak. Wanting harmony does not mean you lack confidence. It means you're emotionally intelligent. But emotional intelligence without language becomes self-erasure.
Wow, that's powerful. Because that's exactly it. When you don't have the phrases to soften your message, you soften yourself instead. You remove your opinion entirely.
And that inner dialogue becomes automatic. You don't even question it anymore. Someone asks, "What do you think?" and your brain immediately scans for danger instead of clarity.
I want to talk about something very specific here. The fear of tone. Many learners are not afraid of grammar mistakes. They're afraid of sounding cold, of sounding aggressive, of sounding arrogant, because tone feels harder to control than words.
Yes, and English especially can feel sharp if you translate directly from another language. So learners internalize this idea. If I speak less, I reduce risk. But what they don't see is silence also sends a message.
And sometimes that message is, I don't care, or I don't have an opinion, or even I agree, when none of those are true.
This creates emotional exhaustion because you're constantly monitoring yourself, filtering yourself, editing yourself in real time.
And that's why speaking English can feel tiring, even when the conversation is simple. You're not just speaking, you're performing safety.
I want to pause here for a second because this is important. If you feel tired after English conversations, it doesn't mean your English is bad. It means you're carrying emotional weight.
And that weight comes from fear of impact, not lack of ability.
Exactly. And here's the hopeful part. Fear softens when you give it structure, when you know how to express disagreement gently, when you know how to share opinions with warmth, when you trust that clarity can be kind.
That's where language becomes a tool, not a threat. And that's what we're building toward in this episode. Not louder English, not faster English, but safer English.
Because when you feel safe, your voice comes back.
And in the next block, we're going to step out of the inner world and into real life, work situations, friendships, social moments, and we'll explore how expressing opinions softly can actually strengthen relationships, not damage them.
Because being respectful doesn't mean being silent. Let's take everything we've talked about, the fear, the inner dialogue, the hesitation, and place it into real situations. Because this fear doesn't live in theory. It lives at work. It lives with friends. It shows up in everyday moments when someone looks at you and says, "So, what do you think?"
Yes, and the first place many people feel this pressure is at work. Meetings, especially, because meetings combine everything that feels risky: status, hierarchy, time pressure, and the feeling that your words will be remembered.
I remember being in meetings where I had a different idea, but I could feel my body tightening before I even opened my mouth. Not because the idea was bad, but because I didn't know how to enter the conversation without sounding confrontational.
And that's such an important word, enter, because expressing an opinion isn't just about what you say, it's about how you arrive. Do you arrive gently? Do you acknowledge others first? Do you create a bridge before crossing?
Exactly. For example, instead of jumping straight into disagreement, someone might say, I see your point and I agree with part of it. I was just thinking about another angle. That single sentence changes the emotional temperature of the room.
And what's interesting is that this isn't about being fake. It's about being relational. You're signaling, I'm not here to fight. I'm here to contribute.
This also applies strongly in friendships, because disagreement with friends can feel even scarier. At work, roles protect you. With friends, emotions are closer to the surface.
Yes, and many people stay quiet in friendships because they don't want to disturb the connection. They think honesty might damage the bond, but unspoken feelings slowly do that anyway.
I've seen this happen when friends are choosing plans. Someone suggests something, everyone agrees out loud, but inside, one person is uncomfortable, tired, or uninterested. And instead of saying something, they say nothing.
And later, that silence turns into resentment, not toward the friends, but toward themselves. They think, why didn't I speak up?
That's why soft language matters so much. Saying something like, I'm not totally sure this works for me, but I don't want to block the group either. That's honest. That's kind. That's human.
It doesn't demand, it doesn't accuse. It simply reveals your reality.
Social situations are another big area, especially with new people. When you're meeting someone for the first time, expressing opinions can feel like a risk to your image.
Yes, because first impressions feel fragile. People think, if I disagree, they won't like me. But often, the opposite is true.
When opinions are shared respectfully, they actually make conversations more interesting. They show personality. They show presence.
I've noticed that people who express opinions gently tend to be trusted more, not less, because they're clear but not aggressive.
Travel situations are also a big one. Ordering food, clarifying misunderstandings, correcting mistakes. Many people stay silent even when something is wrong because they're afraid of sounding rude in another culture.
And that fear is understandable, but there's a difference between being rude and being clear. Saying, sorry, I think there might be a small mistake here, is not disrespectful. It's practical.
And personal growth. This might be the most important area, because learning to express opinions kindly builds self-trust.
Yes, every time you speak up with care, you send yourself a message. My thoughts matter. I can be honest and kind at the same time. I don't disappear to keep peace.
And over time, something shifts. You stop rehearsing everything in your head. You stop over-editing. Your voice becomes more natural.
And that's the real goal. Not perfect sentences, but aligned communication, where your thoughts and your words finally meet.
In the next block, we'll give you the language that supports this alignment. Not memorized scripts, but flexible phrases that protect your tone while freeing your voice.
Because kindness and clarity are not opposites. They're partners. Before we get into the phrases themselves, I want to slow this moment down a little. Because these phrases are not just about English. They're about permission. Permission to exist in a conversation without apologizing for your thoughts. Permission to disagree without feeling like you're breaking something. Permission to speak and still feel safe afterward.
Yes, and I want to say this clearly. You don't need aggressive language to sound confident, and you don't need perfect grammar to sound respectful. These phrases work because they carry emotional intelligence, not because they're fancy. So let's take them one by one, calmly, with space to breathe.
Let's start with a phrase that creates instant softness. I might be wrong, but I see it a little differently. Now, this phrase is powerful because it lowers resistance before it even appears. You're not attacking. You're not claiming absolute truth. You're opening a door. For example, imagine you're in a meeting and someone proposes an idea that doesn't fully convince you. Instead of saying, "That's not a good idea," you say, "I might be wrong, but I see it a little differently." That sentence gives everyone emotional space. I've used this phrase when I wasn't even unsure, but I wanted the conversation to stay collaborative. And interestingly, people lean in instead of pulling away.
This next one is especially helpful when you want to disagree without sounding cold. I understand where you're coming from, and I see it another way. What this phrase does is acknowledge the person before the opinion. You're saying, "I see you." For example, with a friend, "I understand where you're coming from, and I see it another way. For me, this feels a bit overwhelming." I remember using this with a colleague who was very passionate. If I had jumped straight into disagreement, it would have turned defensive fast. But this phrase kept the conversation human.
Here's one that's gentle but very honest. I'm not completely comfortable with that. This phrase is about boundaries, emotional ones. It doesn't accuse, it doesn't explain too much, it simply states your inner truth. I've used this with friends, at work, even in travel situations. And every time it felt like choosing self-respect without creating conflict. Sometimes clarity is kindness.
This next phrase is especially helpful when you want to contribute without dominating. From my perspective, it looks like this phrase reminds everyone that you're sharing a view, not the truth. For example, from my perspective, it looks like this could cause delays later. I love this phrase because it sounds thoughtful. It invites discussion instead of shutting it down.
Now, this one is perfect for moments when emotions are involved. I don't mean this in a negative way, but some people worry this sounds weak, but it's actually protective. It frames your intention before your message. I've used this in sensitive conversations where the relationship mattered more than winning, and people felt that.
Here's a phrase that helps when you're unsure but still want to speak. I'm still thinking about this, but my first reaction is, this phrase buys you time and presence. It tells people you're engaged, even if you're processing. I remember using this when I didn't have the perfect words yet, and surprisingly, people respected the honesty more than confidence.
This one is subtle but powerful. That makes sense, and I wonder if you're validating and expanding. For example, that makes sense, and I wonder if there's another option we haven't considered. This phrase keeps conversations alive instead of polarized.
Now this one is important for disagreement without tension. I see your point, even though I don't fully agree. You're not hiding your difference, you're just presenting it calmly. This phrase helped me stop avoiding disagreements altogether.
Here's one that's especially useful in social settings. For me personally, it feels different. This removes blame completely. You're not saying the other person is wrong, just that your experience is different. That's powerful.
And let's close the phrases with one that builds confidence over time. This is just my opinion, but I wanted to share it. This phrase reminds you and others that your voice has value. I used to stay silent because I thought my thoughts didn't add enough. This phrase helped me step forward anyway.
Notice something about all these phrases. None of them rush. None of them attack. None of them disappear. They stand calmly in the middle. Before we end this episode, I want to take a moment to breathe together. Because if you're listening to this, chances are this topic touched something personal. Maybe you've stayed quiet in conversations, even when you had something important to say. Maybe you've replayed moments in your head thinking, "I should have spoken up." Or maybe you've spoken and then immediately felt guilty afterward. And if that's you, you're not alone. I've been there so many times, sitting in a room, feeling my heartbeat faster, thinking about how my words might sound, how they might be received, how they might change the energy. And sometimes choosing silence felt safer than choosing honesty.
Yeah, and I think that's something we don't talk about enough. We often think confidence means being loud or quick or sharp, but real confidence, especially in another language, is much quieter than that. It's choosing your words carefully. It's allowing yourself to pause. It's trusting that your perspective has value, even if it's different. I used to believe that if I softened my language, people wouldn't take me seriously. But what I discovered over time is that softness and strength can exist together. And actually, they often work better that way.
Exactly. Expressing opinions without sounding rude isn't about pleasing everyone. It's about respecting yourself and the people you're speaking with. It's about realizing that disagreement doesn't have to break connection, that different views don't mean conflict, that your voice doesn't need permission to exist. And the phrases we shared today, they're not rules, they're tools. You don't need to memorize them perfectly. You don't need to use all of them. Even choosing one phrase and using it slowly, naturally, can change how you show up in conversations.
And I want to say something directly to you, listening right now. If English sometimes makes you feel smaller, if you hesitate because you're afraid of sounding rude, wrong, or awkward, that doesn't mean you lack confidence. It means you care. And caring is not a weakness, it's a sign of emotional intelligence. The goal isn't to sound perfect. The goal is to sound human, to speak in a way that feels aligned with who you are, not who you think you should be.
So maybe after this episode, the next time you feel that familiar tension, that moment when you want to speak but you're unsure, you don't push yourself. You don't force confidence. You simply breathe, choose one gentle phrase, and let your voice exist. That's enough.
And remember, growth doesn't happen in dramatic moments. It happens in small choices. One sentence, one conversation, one time you speak even when your voice shakes a little. That's real progress.
Thank you for spending this time with us, for listening, for reflecting, for allowing yourself to grow, slowly, naturally, honestly. We'll be right here in the next episode.
Take care of yourself and keep speaking in your own way.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment down below.